Hey guys, it's Darkness Tales, and just before the video gets started, I have a new short film out called Late. You should definitely check it out. I'll leave an annotation on screen at the end of the video, so please give it some support, critique, whatever you want to do. With that being said, let's jump right into the story. The moment I had signed the sales contract for the old farmhouse, I had been happier than I was in years. You see, in life, I did everything right. I heeded the advice of my teachers and parents. After I'd finished school, I went on to university and got my degree in business. I graduated with honors and started working at a fancy company. After a decade and a half, I'd climbed high enough in the corporate ladder to be head of the sales department. It meant quite the salary, but also more responsibility and more hours on the job. During these years, I moved into a newer, fancier place every couple years, bought more luxuries, but spent less and less time home enjoying it all. With each passing year, I grew to hate my life a bit more. I hated my job, my apartment, and even the overcrowded city I lived in. I was yearning for a break, for some quiet and solitude. When my Uncle Dennis died, I was surprised to be named the sole benefactor. Apparently, he had no other relatives but me. Selling most of his property left me with a substantial sum. With the savings I already had, I decided it was time for a change. I had long dabbled with the idea of moving to a rural area, growing my own vegetables, get a few chickens, and live a self-sustaining lifestyle far away from the big city. It sounded nice. It had always been something I was interested in, a sort of fantasy. Reality was different. There were always deadlines to make, projects to finish, and contracts to discuss and sign. Time moved along, and year after year I did nothing. Now, though, enough was enough. I didn't want to end up like the people who'd finally made it to retirement only to realize that they were now too old and feeble to follow their dreams. When I quit my job, my boss was surprised and flabbergasted. Of course, I still had my termination period of 4 weeks, but most of that time was spent to make adjustments. While my boss was busy finding a replacement for me, I started to look around for a promising property. After a week of searching, I found it. It was an old farmhouse with quite a few plots around. It was located in a small village near a mountainous area. Until 2 years ago, it had been owned by a woman, but after she died, her son had put it up for sale. When I visited the place, I saw that it was an old and not just a bit run-down house. But I was sure all this could be fixed. My last day of work arrived quickly. It was a few weeks later that I finally signed the sales contract and started to move with what few belongings I wanted to keep to the old farmhouse. Once I'd put together some sort of temporary living quarters, I decided it was time to move in. I tried my hands at remodeling the old house myself, but I was soon reminded that I never had any talent using my hands. In the end, I gave up in frustration and contracted a company for it. It took another couple weeks, but once they were done, the place looked nice, cozy, and modern. After the repairs on the chicken crop were finished, I bought a half-dozen chickens and a roaster. Being woken up by him in the morning reminded me of those childhood days I spent at my grandparents' farm. The nostalgia flooded over me in pleasant waves as I drank my morning coffee. By now, I decided it was time to visit what few neighbors I had. To the north of me, quite a bit away, lived an older lady, and next to her a middle-aged couple whose kids went to middle school. After my initial introductions, I didn't have much to do with them. To the south lived an older couple, the Richters. They lived in a huge old house. They used to be farmers themselves when they were younger, but had since retired. They were nice, and assured me they'd help me out if I ever needed anything, or had any problems. After that, there was only one person left, the old man living to the farm east of me. It was an old farmer who I guessed was in his late 50s or early 60s. He owned the fields adjacent to mine. Only a small dirt road divided our properties. I had seen him from afar a few times, but whenever I greeted him, he ignored me. His face was hard, as if carved from stone. His lips were always pressed together, and he had a perpetually angry expression. The moment I walked over toward his farm, he tried his best to ignore me yet again. When he saw that I walked toward him, he turned to me. His face showed that he'd rather be doing anything else but talk to me. "Hello, I'm Daniel Langscheid. I bought the... know damn well who you are. You're the guy who bought Lisbeth's old house and made it all fancy and whatnot." Yeah. Nice to meet you." With that, I held out my hand for a greeting. He didn't budge, or even look at the hand I was awkwardly holding out in the empty air between us. "Why'd you move here?" "No, I was gonna try my luck at farming. I always wanted to grow my own." I broke up as the old man burst into laughter. "You? Farming? Your hands are as soft as a girl's. That land is tough. I'll tell you right away that you won't grow a damn thing here. We don't need city folks like out here." With that, he spat on the ground in front of me, and without another word, made his way towards his shack. For a while, I stood there looking after the old guy. I was nothing short of surprised and dumbfounded. Why'd he thrown so much hate at me? What the hell was his problem? More than a bit mad, I went back home. What I had done to get this type of reaction, I don't know. In the end, I told myself that he was most likely a miserable old fool, who hated himself and people in general. Not my problem. From that point onward, I tried my best to get the farm going. My knowledge was limited, though minimal. The internet, with its endless information, is fantastic, but it was all secondhand knowledge. I soon realized that if I ever wanted to learn how to do anything, I'd have to get my hands dirty. I started with the old lady's small garden and planted a variety of different vegetables. The month after that, I got the old greenhouse running again. I soon had to learn that real life was no harvest moon. Running a farm and growing vegetables was tough. Needless to say, things didn't grow well at all. It was at a later meeting with Hans Richter that he and his wife told me that the ground here wasn't the best anymore. They didn't know what it was, but almost everyone had trouble getting things to grow here. You'd need a lot of care and fertilizer if you wanted to succeed. A decade ago, a few small-time farmers were still living here. As things got harder, most of them abandoned the trade. Some turned to raise livestock, others changed to different professions. There was only one single person whose fields were still flourishing. Old Werner's. It turned out that old Werner was none other than my next-door neighbor. When I told the Richters how my introduction went with him, they both started to laugh. Werner was a bitter old man. He didn't like people and had lived alone most of his life. He was a very solitary man. When I asked if something happened to him, they both said no. It was just how he was. I'd be best to ignore him. That's what everyone else did anyway. As I'd said, I took things slow, worked the garden, studied different types of seeds, how to take care of crops, and many other topics. It was early summer by then, so much too late to actually sow anything in the fields, so I let them lay fallow for the year. As summer moved along, though, I was surprised to see how the old man's fields were bursting with ripe grain and vegetables. Sure, they told me the old man was doing all right, but what I saw was more than that. No, he seemed to be doing pretty damn well. I could barely get a couple of tomato plants to bear fruit in the greenhouse, yet he had fields of them. Harvest came and went. I was frustrated with my own inability to grow anything, but also impressed at how well he was doing. I didn't like it one bit. As summer turned to autumn, there was one thing I found a bit strange. I often caught the old guy driving out in the middle of the night and returning back home a few hours later. I'd noticed by accident when I was out one night. I decided to take a walk in the mild autumn air and gaze at the stars. I was on my way to a local viewing platform when a car approached me from behind. Its headlights were off, and it sped past me. Yet I was sure I'd seen old Werner. I didn't think anything of it, yet I wondered why he drove around without his headlights on. My first thought was that he forgot to turn them on, or hell, he might just be an asshole who likes to scare people. In time, I learned that the old man was making these ominous trips frequently, always in the middle of the night and still without his headlights on. There was no other explanation. He was trying not to get noticed. Well, to be honest, it was none of my business, and I told myself to ignore him and his weird antics. Yet I couldn't help but find it unnerving. I started to wonder what reason he had for the strange nightly trips. It didn't help that he kept it up all autumn and continued well into early winter. It was a sheer mystery to me. Once the new year began and spring came around, I started to do the same as all the other farmers. I started working my fields. I got quite a few stares and scoffs from old Werner. Many snide remarks were directed at me, or I'd seen him laugh his ass off when things didn't work out for me. To tell you the truth, I tried my very best to stay above his petty behavior. Every once in a while, though, I couldn't help but yell back something similar. I'd had a few very long talks with Hans Richter, and he'd been paying me the occasional visit. He helped me to get things going, advised me on when to sow what fertilizer to use, and so many other important things. I have no clue what I'd have done without him. He was a godsend. Still, it didn't matter all too much. Things just didn't grow. Each day I walked the fields looking at rows upon rows of barren earth. Only here and there a few lonely plants were growing. Old Werner's fields, on the other hand, were thriving, and of course the old man wasn't shy rubbing it in. "You city folks just don't have it in you, that's what it is." He'd shout over at me and start laughing. At other times, he was condescending like an asshole, pitying me. "That's as far as you'll get. If I were you, I'd give up while I still could. No reason to keep trying." I hated that damned old man. One day, after I'd watered the few lonely plants that were growing, he came over to pull another one of his nasty jokes. "Shouldn't water 'em too much. Don't want these few plants you accidentally got to grow to waste on you, do ya?" "How the hell do you do it?" I asked instead of reacting to his remark. He just stared at me. "How come your crops are growing so well when no one else can do it? And don't give me this city folk bullshit. Everyone else tells me they've got trouble as well." The old man's face started to distort in a knowing grin, yet he said nothing. At that moment, I remembered how often I'd seen him walk the fields with these unnamed bags of fertilizer. "Is it that fertilizer of yours?" "Not as dumb as you look," he answered. "So what sort of fertilizer is it? Do you make it yourself? What do you put in it?" The old man burst out laughing. "You think I'm going to tell you a damn thing about it? Oh, I don't think so," he said, spitting on the ground. "This is my very own special formula. You've no idea what I'm going through to make it, to perfect it. Before I tell anyone, especially you, I'd rather have the devil take me away." Without another word, he turned around and stormed back to his farm. As the weeks went on, most of my fields should stay barren. The old man's were covered in lush green like they'd been the year before. What the hell was in that fertilizer of his, I wondered. It was sometime later when I visited the Richters that I saw the local newspaper on the kitchen table. I half-heartedly opened it, and an article caught my eye. "Middle-aged woman is still missing since last autumn." The article was about a woman, a mother of two, who'd gone missing on a hiking trip in the nearby area last year. And when I started reading, Susan, Hans' wife, came over. "Such a sad story. I wonder why it keeps happening." "Hold on, what do you mean?" "Oh, it's those hiking paths near the mountains. Each year people vanish there. The authorities say it's slippery slopes and people aren't careful enough. Why don't they close it off?" "It really is something," her husband said. "They always warn hikers and climbers, but people don't listen. A mother of two? What was she even thinking?" I listened to them and learned that more than a dozen people had gone missing near the mountain range. Last year, it hadn't only been the woman, but an older man as well. They said it was almost inevitable that people went missing there. Of course, people talked to the local council, but they didn't listen. The normal hiking paths and climbing locations were safe and secure, and there were enough warnings about straying from them. As I listened to them, there was something in the back of my mind, something I couldn't quite grasp. Only when I returned home and saw old Werner stalking around his fields did I remember what it was. The woman had gone missing in autumn. Wasn't that the time when he went on all those trips? I realized what my brain was trying to put together. The more I thought about it, the more everything did fit together. He drove out in the middle of the night, headlights off, to an unknown location, and there was a special fertilizer of his. For a moment, I couldn't help but imagine old Werner out on the hiking paths at night searching for lonely wanderers to turn them into fertilizer. What was I thinking? I almost burst out laughing at my own ridiculous idea. This wasn't a movie. This was real life. Somehow, though, I couldn't completely get rid of the idea. I don't know why I did it, but I started to spy on the old man. It might have been my frustration. It might have been from boredom. It might have been the resentment I felt towards him. I'm not sure. It wasn't that I believed in my idea. It was way too far-fetched. I told myself that all I wanted was to figure out how he grew his crops and what sort of fertilizer he used. I knew I was only lying to myself, though. Now, I thought there was more about this old fool, his strange behavior, and that fertilizer of his. The more I thought about it, the more I was able to convince myself. Whenever I saw him out in the fields applying his fertilizer, my thoughts went back to the same topic. I told myself to stop and leave it alone, but I couldn't. It wasn't long before my curiosity turned into an obsession, and I started to take tabs on him. I took notes on how often he went out, when he got up in the morning, how long he stayed up in the evening, and many other things. It wasn't like I had much else to do anyway. Most of my fields resembled a barren wasteland anyways. After a couple weeks, I had this whole routine written down. I knew pretty much everything that went on his farm. So I was more than a bit surprised when I saw him drive out with his car in the middle of the night on Saturday. He hadn't done that in the past 5 weeks. It was by sheer coincidence that I'd even noticed it. It was already early morning when he returned. I saw him get out of his car, but instead of going back inside, he went to the back of the car and opened the trunk. In the dark of night, hunched behind my window, I pressed my binoculars against my head so hard it hurt. My whole body tensed up, and I didn't dare or move or breathe. In horror, I watched how old Werner dragged something out of the trunk. It was long, big, and covered in a thick blanket. I watched as he heaved it over his shoulder. As he took a first step towards his hack, I saw something long and thin dangle from the pack. Oh, Jesus Christ, I thought. Don't tell me. Is that what I thought it was? Had I really seen it? No, I must be wrong. I was seeing things. Maybe I'd imagined it. But what I'd seen dangling, it couldn't be. I thought back to the woman in the newspaper article. Was this another one? Another victim, another ingredient for his fertilizer? I had to go there and find out more. I should take a look at the shack. The moment I saw how old Werner returned from his shack, all thoughts about going there left my mind. It was dark, but in the moonlight I could clearly see that his hands and lower arms were covered in something. I saw his dark, angry expression as he made his way back to his house. My whole body was filled with fear. For the first time in my entire life, I was honestly and utterly terrified. I couldn't help the urge to hide as soon as he walked back to his house. I knew there was no reason for it. The old guy couldn't possibly see me. I had the lights off and I was way too far away from him to notice anything at the windows. Once he'd vanished inside, I started to calm down, at least a bit. My mind was still a crazed whirlwind of contradicting ideas. One part of it said I was stupid and nothing was going on. The other part told me that old Werner was a crazed serial killer. Even in bed, I couldn't calm down, and it took me a long time till I actually fell asleep. When the rooster awoke me in the morning, I was thankful that a few hours of sleep I'd had were undisturbed and free from dreams about bloodied old men. While I was drinking my morning coffee, I watched his house as I had done every morning for the past 2 weeks. As if nothing had happened last night, the old man went out to take care of his fields. Had this guy really murdered someone last night and dragged the body into his shack? As I sat there, I was almost shaking with curiosity. I had to find out. I had to. I knew that every week on Sunday evening, he spent an hour or two at his shack. During that time, he most likely fixed up his fertilizer. Once he was done, he went back to his house and most likely straight to bed. This might be the best chance to see what he's up to there. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this part 1 of the creepypasta Fertilizer. If you did, I'm going to leave the link to the story down below, so be sure to give the author some love. If you liked the video, make sure to click that like button, hit subscribe and the little bell so you can be notified when the next one pops up. I'm going to leave on screen a clickable link for the short film Late, so please go check that out. And as always, my Darkness Militia, have a terrifying evening.